Second time, and I give the call to the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The watchdogs have to be constantly watched. Nonetheless, watchdogs are necessary. Liberty and security go hand in hand. Without liberty, there can be no security. Without security, there can be no liberty. A rather poignant quote from the Canberra Times editorial in May 1984. One of the key differences between a democracy and a totalitarian regime is the lack of effective oversight of the executive in the latter. This is an issue I spoke on about a fortnight ago in the debate on the Ministers of State Amendment Bill. Likewise, on the bill for the National Anti-Corruption Commission, I opine that corruption undermines trust, and trust is the basis of legitimate government. This legislation is also about effective oversight and of parts of the executive government that must, of necessity, conduct most of their operations secretly. The Inspectorate of Intelligence and Security is a fundamental way in which trust is engendered in the workings of our security services. The integrity and respect are vital in our national institutions. Today, the Office of Inspector General of Intelligence and Security is headed by the Honourable Christopher Jessup, KC, and has broad support across the Parliament, as we've heard from our previous speakers, as does the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which was established at the same time. But this was not always the case. The Hope Royal Commission on Intelligence and Security was established by the Whitlam government in 1974 and reported in 1977. In 1986, the Hawke government enacted the legislation for an Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, which had been a recommendation of that commission. When the legislation was before the Parliament in 1986, it was opposed quite vehemently by some members of the then opposition. The late Honourable Michael McKellar, the Liberal member for Warringah, said, "I have great difficulty in accepting that the office, when it is established, will do anything but make it more difficult for ASIO to operate in a proper fashion." The Honourable Neil Brown, the former Liberal member for Menzies, said, "The very notion of having an Inspector General to second-guess an intelligence agency is utterly absurd, and it is a severe restriction on its effectiveness. The powers to be given to the Inspector General will negate a lot of the effectiveness of ASIO and its activities." And the opposition spokesperson, the late Liberal Honourable John Spender, said, "We certainly would not permit in any legislation to be introduced into this House when we have the carriage of legislation that there should be inquiries of the kind contemplated by the bill, that is, inquiries into practices alleged to be contrary to human rights. It is perfectly absurd and quite obnoxious that the kind of inquiry should be directed against an intelligence organisation." Well, those fears have not been realised in the decades since the creation of this legislation. Former Labor Attorney General Lionel Bowen, upon introducing the bill, said that he believed that the creation of this office is a highly beneficial addition to the machinery of government. Interestingly, some commentators have suggested that the rise of integrity agencies constitutes a new differentiation and separation of powers within our system of government. We have all grown up with the teaching that the Australian system involves three heads of power: the legislature, the executive and the judiciary. Integrity bodies, however, such as IGIS and the new National Anti-Corruption Commission, are not easily categorised under any of these. Perhaps we need to accept that our world has changed, and so change the way we describe and teach about our separation of powers. Indeed, on the introduction of this amending bill, Attorney General Dreyfus stated quite rightly that strong and effective oversight mechanisms do not stand in opposition to Australia's national security interests. They are best understood as an essential part of advancing them. And separate from the Office of the IGIS and constituted by its own Act, we also, of course, have the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, which reviews the operation, effectiveness and implications of national security and counter-terrorism laws. And the current Independent National Security Legislation Monitor is Mr Grant Donaldson, SC. So I agree with the Attorney-General on the need for strong and effective oversight mechanisms. In 2010, I was the Principal Policy Advisor to 3 consecutive Western Australian Premiers on security and emergency management. These were the Labor Premiers Gallop and Carpenter and Liberal Premier Barnett. In that role, I advised the Premiers on our state responses to terrorism. I worked on the committees supporting the national counter-terrorism efforts and provided input into the COAG processes then and the decision-making, providing drafting instructions on different laws, both state and federal. As part of my role, was working on the National Counter-Terrorism Legislative Committee. I was specifically involved in the drafting of the National Anti-Terrorism Act and the state equivalent versions, particularly around preventative detention. And I can share with the House that during those deliberations, the questions of safeguards and human rights were front and centre, and the role of IGES in ensuring propriety and respect for human rights was appreciated and valued, although I might say contested. This was at a time when David Hicks was still in Guantanamo Bay, and we can recall the history records on the struggle it was to restore human rights and dignity for him, to return him to Australia. And the extent to which the legislation was unified around the nation to be reflected in state laws completely underpins the need for these oversight bodies. So the preventative detention laws, which refers back to the anti-terrorism acts, enables a person to be detained without charge, without the knowledge of their family, their employer, for a given period of time. And I had the responsibility of inspecting the potential places where a person could be detained, and in jurisdictions like Western Australia, certainly back then, I can't speak for where it's at today, but certainly back then the accommodation options were limited, particularly for women and juveniles. So we're talking about extreme draconian laws that we had to work through, and the only sense of assurity that the human rights of each individual would be observed within the constraints of trying to prevent an act of terrorism or to control a person who committed an act of terrorism where their freedom of movements would be limited, was in fact having that security inspector to oversight that activity. So with any security legislation, state or federal, there is a need for vigilance, not only for the operations of those powers, but also against the creep of powers. I certainly know the time of those meetings, extensive meetings we held in framing and forming and drafting those laws. We were very concerned that they were understood to be draconian. They were only meant to be used in the context of terrorism. But since that time, I'm sad to say that I've seen the laws stretched to be considered to be appropriate to apply against bikies. I've seen them attempted to be applied to protesters. This was never the intention of those laws. And it's important that our security... Sorry
to interrupt, but the division has been called in for the House of Representatives. The proceedings here will be suspended to enable honourable members to attend.
The member for Hasluck.
So in a democracy, we must minimise laws that can only be described as draconian. And it's all the more reason to have an oversight body to assist and provide feedback where operations fall short of the mark in any area. This amending Act helps to further empower the IGES in reasonable and measured ways. I note that the Attorney-General has flagged a number of other areas in the field of security which are under active review. So the Inspector-General works in two main ways. One, the Office is empowered to conduct inquiries. The amending bill seeks to enhance the ability of the Inspector to commence an inquiry. Secondly, the Inspector conducts proactive inspection activities. Through both of these roles, the IGES supports the creation of a culture of compliance within the intelligence organisations. There is also regular formal correspondence between the IGES and each of the agencies. These points of contact and the ability of IGES to make recommendations to the agency heads contribute to a more reflective intelligence service. Recommendations by the Aegis appear to be taken very seriously, and it's important to note that the Aegis has the powers of a Royal Commission and can report his or her dissatisfaction to a minister, and albeit in a careful manner, in the annual report tabled to Parliament. The Aegis is also able to provide feedback to the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. The powers of the Aegis are a significant consideration which intelligence agencies must take into account when conducting their important work. In order to conduct their oversight role, Aegis officers are cleared and empowered to enter any Australian security agency and inspect the work being done, including emails, files, correspondence and other documentation. In relation to this task, I understand that the Aegis is now building its own IT department, whereas it has in the past been reliant on the IT services of each agency. Last year's annual report by Aegis disclosed that the organisation received hundreds of pieces of correspondence, 80 of which were ascertained to be complaints under the Act. In relation to their oversight of each organisation, the reports on ASIO is demonstrative. 21 inspections completed and 30 compliance incidents reported. When we create security legislation and when we create legislation to provide oversight of our security apparatus, we are engaged in a balancing exercise. In a democratic society, there must be ways to assure ourselves that our security agencies are acting with propriety, while at the same time allowing them to carry out their activities without the publicity that would render them less effective. In this balancing exercise, there are a number of rights and interests that need to be considered. Principles of the separation of powers that I spoke to earlier between the different branches of government, of the divisions of powers between levels of government within the Federation, and accountability of government agencies, work practices within those agencies, civic and human rights, and of course the right to protest. The Independent Security Legislation Monitor, which commenced in 2010, carried into being by the Attorney-General and the previous Labor government. The Attorney-General referred in his second reading speech on that bill that the balance between the liberties that Australians enjoy, indeed the liberties that Australians have fought wars for, and the need for authorities to be armed. We have separated the roles of overseeing the legislative framework by the Independent Security Legislation Monitor and overseeing the operations of agencies by the Aegis. This separation is a good thing. The modern role played by our security agencies is not easier than in the past. Researcher Ben Scott recently remarked that the blurring of old distinctions between security, economics, development and technology is a recurring theme of the new geopolitics. Globalisation, economic interdependencies and the increase in cyber interference and attacks, sometimes state-sponsored, mean that it is more difficult terrain for our services to navigate. It is, in short, a more difficult world within which to write a credible spy thriller and a more difficult world in which to operate a security agency. I am satisfied that the system that we have here is working and that the amendments to this Act will assist the Aegis in its important work. I commend the bill.